Three things happened today that the White House has no answer for. America threatened China with 100% tariffs if it kept buying Iranian oil. China said three words on the record in a formal government response: "We don't care." A Japanese tanker crossed the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since this conflict began and paid Iran for passage in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. Yuan and the Wall Street Journal confirmed that Iran is now exporting oil to China by railway, bypassing the blockade entirely through a continental rail corridor that connects Iranian oil fields to Chinese refineries through Central Asian territory that no American warship can reach. Three actions, three countries, one picture. And that picture tells you something about power that no official statement, no military briefing, no press conference will ever say out loud. The Strait of Hormuz, the waterway America spent 60 days and $20 billion trying to control, is no longer a neutral international passage. It has a new administration, and today, three separate actions confirmed exactly who that administration answers to. China chose Iran over Trump, and the strait is now theirs. Let me take you through exactly what these three actions mean, why each one individually is significant, and all three together are transformative, and why the architecture they collectively describe is not a series of improvised responses to American pressure, but a deliberately constructed alternative system for moving Iranian energy to Chinese buyers that operates completely outside the framework that American policy was designed to control. Most people watching this story are focusing on the specific events: the tariff threat, the tanker crossing, the railway confirmation. All of that is real. But the real story is not any individual event. It is the architecture that all three events together reveal, and the permanence of that architecture once it is established. Because systems are harder to undo than policies, and what China and Iran built around the American blockade while the blockade was being constructed is not a crisis management improvisation. It is a permanent alternative to the American-controlled system, and it is now fully operational while America is still officially claiming victory. To understand the full weight of what happened today, you need to start with China's response to America's tariff threat. Because three words said publicly on the record in direct response to America's most extreme available economic threat is the most significant statement made by any government in this conflict. Since Iran's foreign minister told America to choose between ceasefire and continued operations, to understand why those three words matter so much, you need to understand what the blockade was designed to do. The blockade's entire strategic logic depends on cutting off Iran's revenue. If Iran cannot sell its oil, if its primary income stream is severed, economic pressure accumulates until the situation becomes unsustainable for the Iranian government. That is the mechanism, not direct military confrontation, economic strangulation. Cut the money, wait for the system to break. China buys more Iranian oil than any other country by an enormous margin. China is Iran's most important energy customer. Before the war, China was purchasing approximately 90% of Iran's seaborne crude, more than 500 million barrels in a single year. America knew this, which is why the tariff threat was 100%. The most painful number available, a tariff equal to the full value of every Chinese product entering the American market. That is not a warning, that is an ultimatum. Give up Iranian oil or we collapse your export economy. And China said, we don't care. Keep the tariffs, we will keep buying. Here is what that response does to the blockade's strategic logic in one sentence. If China keeps buying Iranian oil regardless of American threats, if Iran's primary revenue stream is protected by Chinese defiance, then the blockade's central mechanism fails. Not partially, not at the margins. Structurally, the economic pressure that was supposed to accumulate until Iran broke is not accumulating. It is being absorbed by China's willingness to bear the cost of defiance on Iran's behalf. The blockade is in place. The warships are there. The 15,000 American service members supporting Project Freedom are there. The 100 aircraft are there. And Iranian oil is still flowing to Chinese refineries, generating the revenue that sustains Iran's economic viability, funding the government that Trump is trying to pressure into nuclear concessions. The mechanism is broken. Not because of anything that happened on the battlefield, because China said three words. But here is the dimension that most coverage is completely missing. China did not just defy America privately through a quiet decision to continue purchasing. China did it publicly, on the record, in a formal government response, sending a message not just to Washington, but to every government in the world about the limits of American economic leverage when China decides to ignore it. Think about what that public defiance means for every other country watching this conflict. Every finance ministry, every trade department, every government that has been calculating whether to comply with American secondary sanctions pressure is now running the same update. If China can publicly say we don't care to 100% tariffs and pay no meaningful price for it, what does that tell every smaller country about how much weight American economic threats actually carry? It tells them the threats are less credible than they appeared, and that changes behavior, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently in 100 small decisions by governments that used to defer automatically to American pressure and are now asking whether they need to. China's 3 words did not just protect Iran's revenue. They lowered the credibility of American economic coercion for every country watching. That is not a tactical win for China. That is a structural shift in the global balance of economic power delivered in 3 words. Now let me turn to the Japanese tanker, because this is not just a shipping story, it is a financial story, and the financial implications reach far beyond one vessel crossing one waterway. A Japanese tanker crossed the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since this conflict began. It paid Iran for passage in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. Yuan, let me explain exactly why the currency matters as much as the crossing itself. The global oil system has been denominated in American dollars since 1974. That arrangement, the petrodollar system, is one of the most important structural foundations of American financial power because energy is priced in dollars. Every country on earth needs dollars to buy it. That constant global demand keeps the dollar strong, keeps American borrowing costs low, keeps the global financial system oriented around American institutions and American priorities. It is what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously called the exorbitant privilege, the ability to run permanent trade deficits, to borrow at rates lower than any other government, to issue debt that the world will always absorb because the world always needs dollars. That privilege is worth trillions of dollars to the United States every year. And every time a tanker pays for passage in yuan rather than dollars, every time an energy transaction settles outside the dollar system, that foundation erodes. Not dramatically, not visibly in any single transaction, but cumulatively, each payment normalizes the next one. Each transaction outside the dollar system makes the following transaction more routine. Japan is not a small actor in this story. Japan is the world's 3rd largest economy. Japan has been one of America's closest strategic partners for 80 years. Japan is embedded inside the American financial and security architecture more deeply than almost any other country in the world. Japan paying Iran and yuan to cross the strait is one of America's closest allies, making a deliberate financial decision that bypasses the dollar system. Not because Japan has abandoned its alliance with America, because that is what getting energy through the Strait of Hormuz now requires. And that decision, once made, sets a precedent for Japan's own future decisions. For every country watching Japan make it, the strait is now a UN checkpoint. Countries that need to pass through it are making yuan payments to do so. That is the petrodollar system eroding in real time. One tanker at a time, one payment at a time, each transaction small, all of them moving in one direction. Deutsche Bank released a note during this conflict saying it could be remembered as a key catalyst for erosion in petrodollar dominance and the beginnings of the petroin. Today's Japanese tanker payment is the Deutsche Bank note becoming operational reality, not a theoretical future possibility, a present transactional fact. Now let me walk you through the 3rd action, the railway, because this is the one that confirms the blockade is not just being circumvented, it is being made irrelevant. The Wall Street Journal confirmed today that Iran is exporting oil to China by railway, not through the Strait of Hormuz, not through any maritime route that American naval presence can monitor or intercept, by land, through a continental rail corridor that connects Iranian oil fields to Chinese refineries through Central Asian transit territory. The blockade controls access to Iranian ports by sea. It does not control railways. The blockade applies pressure on maritime energy trade. It has no mechanism for stopping overland energy movement. The railway through Central Asia, the same rail infrastructure that China and Iran began building in 2016, with the first freight train from China arriving in Iran in February of that year, has now become an active oil export corridor that the American naval blockade cannot touch, regardless of how many warships are deployed in the Strait of Hormuz. Let me put all three actions together and show you the complete picture they create, because individually, each one could be explained as a response to immediate pressure. Together, they describe something much more significant. Iran's oil reaches China by railway, bypassing the strait and the blockade entirely. China buys that oil regardless of American tariff threats, removing the economic pressure the blockade was designed to apply. And Iran selectively opens the strait to countries willing to pay in Yuan, turning the waterway into both a revenue source and a financial lever simultaneously. These three things together describe an architecture, not a series of improvised responses. A deliberately constructed alternative system for moving Iranian energy to Chinese buyers that operates completely outside the framework American policy was designed to control. Let me use the analogy that makes this most clear. Imagine you try to stop water flowing through a pipe by blocking the pipe. The water finds three other routes simultaneously through a gap on the left, through a crack at the bottom, through a completely different pipe you did not know existed. The block is still in place, but the water is flowing anyway, and now it is flowing through routes that are harder to close because you did not build the infrastructure to stop them. That is exactly what happened with the blockade. The maritime pipe is still blocked, but Iranian oil, Iranian revenue, Iranian energy exports are flowing through three other routes simultaneously. And those routes were not improvised this week. They were built over months of deliberate preparation while the blockade itself was being constructed. The railway infrastructure was built. The Yuan payment system was developed and tested. The shadow fleet was expanded and refined. China's public declaration of defiance was prepared and timed for maximum impact. Every element of the alternative architecture was ready before the blockade was fully deployed, because China had been watching American policy toward Iran for years and had calculated that a blockade scenario was coming and had built the infrastructure to survive it before it arrived. Here is the most important structural point I want you to carry from this analysis. These three routes are now established. The railway exists. The Yuan payment infrastructure exists and has been used by a Japanese tanker. China's public declaration that it will ignore American tariff threats exists on the record and cannot be retracted without China losing face on the global stage in ways that would cost Beijing far more than the tariffs themselves. And systems are harder to undo than policies. The architecture that China and Iran constructed around the blockade will still be there after any ceasefire. It will still be there after any nuclear deal. It will still be there after any change in the immediate political situation. It was not built to manage a crisis. It was built to create a permanent alternative to the American-controlled system, and it has done that. The blockade that America deployed with 15,000 service members, with 100 aircraft, with guided missile destroyers, with the full weight of the most powerful military on Earth, has been circumvented by a railway, a currency payment, and three words. That asymmetry between American military force and Chinese institutional construction is the strategic story of this entire conflict. Now let me connect this to the broader implications for American power, because they extend far beyond the Strait of Hormuz and far beyond this specific conflict. The blockade's three stated objectives were to cut Iranian oil revenue, to demonstrate American control over critical energy flows, and to create economic pressure sufficient to change Iranian behavior on the nuclear question, on every one of those three metrics. Today's three actions confirm that the alternative architecture built around the blockade has failed the mechanism. Iranian oil revenue has been protected by the railway and Chinese purchasing. American control over critical energy flows has been contradicted by China's defiance and Japan's Yuan payment. And the economic pressure that was supposed to change Iranian nuclear behavior has been absorbed, redistributed, and rendered structurally insufficient. The blockade is in place. It is just not working as a blockade. The implications for American economic coercion as a strategic tool extend to every future scenario where Washington might want to apply similar pressure. American sanctions derive their power from two sources: the dollar's dominance in global trade, which means transactions must touch dollar clearing channels that America can monitor and restrict, and the credibility of secondary sanctions threats, which means countries that defy American economic pressure face consequences severe enough to make defiance more costly than compliance. Today's events have tested both sources of that power and found them weaker than America's strategic planning assumed. Japan paying in yuan demonstrates that the dollar's Hormuz choke point role can be bypassed through alternative payment infrastructure. China's public defiance demonstrates that secondary sanctions threats are insufficient to change the behavior of a major power that has decided its interests require defiance. Both demonstrations are now on the record. Both will be studied by every government that faces American economic pressure in the future. And both will inform the calculations those governments make about whether compliance or defiance better serves their interests. Now, let me give you the three scenarios that define where this goes from here. And I want to be precise about what each scenario means for the global order. The first scenario is America acknowledges the architecture and negotiates a framework that incorporates rather than ignores China's role. In this scenario, the May 14th Trump-Xi summit scheduled in Beijing becomes the moment when America acknowledges that China's alternative energy architecture has survived the blockade and negotiates a framework that gives China a formal role in the Hormuz settlement in exchange for Chinese cooperation in pressing Iran toward nuclear concessions. China gets the recognition of its indispensability that its 65 days of strategic positioning has been designed to achieve. America gets the Chinese cooperation on the nuclear question that the blockade alone cannot deliver. The Strait of Hormuz is reopened under a framework that includes both the American-escorted corridor and the Iranian-approved Chinese corridor, effectively formalizing the dual maritime regime that has been developing organically. Iran gets economic relief from a nuclear framework that defers its most sensitive commitments to a subsequent process. The petrodollar system is not restored to its pre-war state, but its erosion is managed rather than accelerated. This is the scenario that the structural logic of the alternative architecture most strongly supports. And it is the scenario where China's three words, "We don't care," are ultimately converted into the specific policy recognition that Beijing has been positioning for since the first bomb fell on February 28th. The second scenario is America escalates further and discovers the limits of escalation. In this scenario, Trump responds to China's public defiance to the Japanese yuan payment to the railway confirmation by announcing additional escalatory measures, more tariffs on China, sanctions on Chinese financial institutions that process UN payments for Iranian oil transit, interdiction of the shadow fleet vessels that carry Iranian crude to Chinese refineries. Each of these escalatory measures is theoretically available to America. None of them is costless. Tariffs on China at 100% would immediately affect American consumers through higher prices on imported goods. Sanctions on Chinese financial institutions would produce Chinese retaliation against American companies operating in China, against American technology imports that depend on Chinese manufacturing, and against the rare earth supply chains that American defense production depends on. Interdiction of shadow fleet vessels carrying oil to China, vessels often flying flags of convenience with multinational crews, creates the kind of incident at sea that the Scarborough Shoal blockade and the PLA exercises are designed to signal China is prepared to escalate in response to the escalatory path is available. It leads to places that no American strategic planner has publicly described as acceptable outcomes. The third scenario is the one I believe deserves the most serious analytical attention because it represents the most honest assessment of the structural trajectory. The alternative architecture that China built around the blockade becomes the permanent template for how sanctioned states can survive American economic pressure with Chinese support. Iran's experience of surviving a naval blockade through railway exports, UN payment systems, and Chinese purchasing defiance is now documented, public, and available as a model for every other state that faces American maximum pressure in the future. Venezuela, North Korea, Russia, any country that China decides its interests require protecting. The infrastructure exists, the precedent exists, the public declaration of Chinese willingness to absorb American tariff threats rather than comply with American sanctions pressure exists on the record. China did not just protect Iran's oil revenue today. China established the proof of concept for a world in which American economic coercion has a structural ceiling, a ceiling defined by Chinese willingness to provide alternative infrastructure to the target of that coercion. That ceiling is the most consequential long-term outcome of the three actions that happened today. Not the railway, not the Yuan payment, not even China's 3 words. The proof of concept that those 3 things together establish here is where I stand, and I will say it with complete directness. China chose Iran over Trump today. Not because China loves Iran, not because China has abandoned its interest in a stable relationship with America. Because China calculated that protecting Iran's economic viability at the cost of 100% tariff threats serves China's long-term strategic interests more than complying with American pressure would. The alternative energy architecture that survives the blockade is worth more to China than the immediate tariff relief that compliance would produce. The UN payment precedent that erodes the petrodollar is worth more than the dollar system stability that deference to American financial pressure would maintain. The proof of concept that China can publicly defy American economic ultimatums without paying an unacceptable price is worth more than the diplomatic smoothness that quiet compliance would purchase. China made a strategic calculation, and the Strait of Hormuz is the place where that calculation has been operationally confirmed. The strait is theirs. Not militarily, not formally, not by any declaration or treaty, but functionally, commercially, financially, and strategically. The waterway that America spent 60 days and $20 billion trying to control is now operating under a governance structure that China and Iran built together, that Japan is paying Yuan to access, and that a railway through Central Asia has made permanently survivable regardless of what the American Navy does at its entrance. I want to know what you think. After today's 3 actions, does America have any remaining mechanism to make the blockade work as intended? Or has China's alternative architecture made the blockade permanently insufficient, regardless of how much military force America deploys in support of it? Leave your answer in the comments right now, because that question defines the future of American economic coercion as a strategic tool against any major power. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the May 14th summit is 10 days away. Trump is going to Beijing having lost the blockade battle to a railway in 3 words. And what she extracts from that summit, knowing exactly how comprehensively China's alternative architecture has survived, will define the global order for the next decade. This is Professor Jiang Xueqin. Stay sharp, stay informed, and never mistake the blockade for the strategy.